The briefing packet had been 47 pages long, and Davin Mercer had read every one of them twice on the transit shuttle from Veth Station. He had notes in the margins. He had phonetic guides rubber-banded to the front. He had tabbed the sections on honorific registers with 4 different colors of adhesive flags: gold for the Queen-specific forms, blue for the court advisory tier, green for the general diplomatic register, red for the ones marked as culturally sensitive. He had spent 11 days in accelerated cultural immersion with the Third Reach Diplomatic Corps. 6 of those days focused exclusively on Verath court protocol, and he had come out the other side confident, genuinely, reasonably confident, that he would not embarrass humanity's new trade attaché in the first 5 minutes of the summit. He had been optimistic. The Verath First Chamber was enormous and cold, the way that rooms designed for formal power were always cold. Marble-pale floors of some material that caught the light in strange ribbons, ceiling vaulted so high that the upper thirds disappeared into shadow, banners of deep indigo and hammered silver hanging perfectly still in air that did not move. The delegations had been placed at opposing ends of a long central corridor defined by low stone markers, each group arranged in a ranked arc, the senior diplomat at the apex, aides and liaisons behind in order of precedence. Trade attaché Vesna Orel stood at the apex of the human delegation, composed and unreadable the way she always was. She had been doing this for 20 years and had met more alien heads of state than Mercer had met foreign nationals of any species. She did not look nervous. She never looked nervous, which Mercer had initially found unnerving and had eventually come to find deeply reassuring, the way you found a fixed point reassuring when other things were moving. Mercer stood 2 steps behind her left shoulder, which was exactly where the briefing packet had told him to stand. He was the cultural and linguistic liaison. His job was to be invisible unless called upon, and when called upon, to translate accurately, smoothly, and without inflection that might imply human editorial opinion. He had a secondary AI system feeding audio to a discrete receiver in his left ear, calibrated to flag any divergence between its rendering and his own, so that he could decide in real time which interpretation to use. He had his phonetic guide folded inside his jacket pocket. He had his card stock for silent flags to Orel. He had his margin notes. He was invisible. He was ready. The door on the far end of the chamber opened. The Verath court entered in procession, which Mercer had expected. He had read about Verath processions. He knew the order: honor guard first, moving in the paired formation that the briefing called a watch seal and that indicated high-security formal context, then the senior court advisors in their black and silver ceremonial sashes, then the ranking nobles, then the Queen. He had seen images. The briefing packet had included 3 all-formal court portraits: the Queen of the Verath Reaches, sovereign of the 7 orbital thrones, keeper of the Vel Accord. The portraits had been formal, composed, lit in the flat way that official images always were. She had looked impressive in them, in the way that all powerful people looked impressive in official portraits, controlled and distant, and somehow slightly larger than the frame. The portraits had not prepared him for the room. She was tall, even for Verath, a species that averaged half a head above most humans. Her skin was the deep, layered color of midnight water, not simply dark but having depth to it, as though light fell slightly differently on her than it did on anything else in the room. Her hair was silver-white, worn in an elaborate structure that somehow managed to look regal without looking constructed, pinned at the crown with an orbital clasp in the 7-pointed shape of the Reach's seal. Her eyes gold, with vertical pupils that expanded slightly as she entered the chamber's brighter light, moved across the room with the kind of deliberate calm that Mercer associated with people who had long since stopped being surprised by anything, and had learned to look at rooms for information rather than for experience. She wore court dress, layered panels of indigo and hammered silver the same tones as the chamber's banners, as though the room had been designed around her or she had been designed around the room. The fabric moved in a way that suggested considerable weight and considerable craft. At her throat, a pendant in the shape of a seven-pointed orbital, the seal of the Reaches, in a smaller, personal form. No crown, because Verath queens did not wear crowns in working sessions. The briefing had been specific about that. Crowns were ceremonial and celebratory, not administrative. A queen in a working session wanted to be taken seriously, not worshipped. The distinction mattered. Her court filed into position behind her. She walked to the apex of the Verath arc with a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, the pace of someone who had decided exactly how fast she was going to walk and was doing it, and the room felt different when she stopped. Not a performance of presence. Just presence, the actual weight of it, filling the space between the stone markers and the vaulted ceiling. HFY took one step forward. This was correct. Mercer had it in his notes, flagged gold. This was the first formal acknowledgement, a step forward by the senior member of the receiving delegation to signal readiness for the opening exchange. What followed next was, in hindsight, entirely Mercer's fault. He had been studying his phonetic guide on the shuttle. Specifically, he had been drilling the opening honorifics, because the briefing packet was emphatic that the first exchange of honorifics in a Verath formal session was the most culturally sensitive moment, and that a mistranslation at that juncture could imply anything from simple ignorance to deliberate insult. Mercer had drilled the correct form for addressing a reigning queen in a working session approximately 400 times. He knew it. He could produce it in his sleep, which he had actually tested by waking himself during the night cycle on the shuttle specifically to check. What he also knew, because he had read every page of that briefing packet, including the cultural footnotes appended to Section 12, the ones that none of his 3 colleagues in the delegation had bothered with, the ones that the Corps' own orientation trainer had described as supplementary context for enthusiasts, was that there was a related form, visually similar on the page and phonetically similar to an untrained ear, that was used in spiritual or memorial contexts to address a queen who had newly ascended following the death of her predecessor. The 2 phrases were nearly identical in written form. In spoken Verath, they differed by a single tonal inflection in the 3rd syllable of the 3rd word, a half-tone drop that, in ambient noise, in a large chamber with stone floors that echoed, even the Corps' own AI translation systems had flagged as difficult to reliably distinguish. This was in a footnote. He had flagged it as a note of interest. He had annotated it in the margin with a small asterisk and the words drilling risk, avoid overlearning the secondary form. He had then promptly spent the rest of the shuttle journey drilling the secondary form, because it was harder, because his mind always pulled toward the harder thing, because he was genuinely interested in the tonal difference and had wanted to understand it fully. The reason it became relevant was that at HFY, executing the form will first address herself rather than handing it to Mercer, which was protocol. The HFY opened, the liaison supported, delivered her opening in standard, and then glanced at him to provide the Verath language parallel phrasing. A courtesy repetition, something the Corps had added to this particular mission's protocol specifically, because it showed respect for the host language and had tested well in pre-summit consultations. And Mercer, who had spent the last 3 hours of the shuttle journey with the memorial form living in his mouth, produced it instead of the one he drilled 400 times. Not the working session queen form. The form used to address a queen who had lost her predecessor to honor her in her ascent. The form that carried, embedded in its structure by centuries of Verath court tradition, a specific quality of acknowledgement. I see that you carry what was handed to you. I see its weight. It was not a phrase of introduction. It was a phrase of reverence, of profound deference, of a specific, solemn quality of acknowledgement that in Verath custom did not come with words alone, it came with a bow. Not a bow the way humans bowed, a polite inclination of the head. A proper Verath bow, which Mercer had apparently absorbed somewhere in his 11 days of immersive drilling, because his body executed it before his brain caught up with what was happening. Shoulders forward, spine parallel to the floor, both hands open at his sides, palms facing the chamber floor, eyes down. The chamber went absolutely still. He was still in the bow when he understood what he had done. He catalogued it in approximately 2 seconds of frozen spine horror. Wrong phrase, wrong register, memorial and reverence form, accompanied by the full formal bow that the phrase structurally required. He had just told the Queen of the Verath Reaches, in perfect idiomatic Verath, that he honored her strength in the face of loss, that her assent was seen and acknowledged, and that he placed himself beneath her gaze in witness of it. He was a cultural liaison, 2 steps behind the left shoulder of a trade attaché. He had just delivered a personal act of formal reverence to a reigning alien queen on behalf of no one but himself, in front of both full delegations, on the first day of a summit that had taken 8 months to schedule. He very slowly began to straighten. Silence. He came back to vertical. He did not look at Aurel. He could not look at Aurel. He looked because there was nowhere else to look at the Queen. She was looking at him. The gold eyes had not moved. She had the expression of someone who had, in the course of a long and demanding career of formal proceedings, seen everything, and had just encountered the one thing she had not catalogued. Not anger, not offense, not the polite blank composure of someone managing an awkward moment. Something more specific and harder to name. The expression of a person who had just been given something unexpected and was taking a moment, without performing the taking of it, to decide what to do. The moment held for approximately 3 heartbeats. Then the Queen inclined her head toward him. A small, deliberate motion, nothing performative about it. The way a decision looks when it's been made rather than the way a courtesy looks when it's being extended, and spoke. Mercer's Verath was excellent. He understood her perfectly. She said, "It is accepted." The summit proceeded. To attaché Aurel's very considerable credit, she neither froze nor pivoted, simply allowed the Queen's response to land, and moved directly into the formal opening exchange, as though nothing unusual had occurred, the way a 20-year veteran moves past an obstacle in the road by stepping over it without breaking stride. Mercer resumed his position 2 steps behind her left shoulder and spent the next 40 minutes doing his actual job, rendering standard into Verath and back, precisely and without inflection, while his pulse gradually descended from the upper atmosphere. He was good at his job even when mortified, possibly because of. There was something about acute embarrassment that narrowed the focus to what was immediately necessary, the word, the tone, the correct rendering, and cut off the ambient noise of everything else. The opening session ran 3 hours. Trade frameworks, resource access, the new Jumpgate licensing terms, the contested boundary markers in the Vel Reach transit corridors. It was dense, technical material, and the Verath delegation presented it with the methodical precision that the briefing packet had predicted. Their senior trade advisor was a long-faced, silver-skinned man named Vel Shurth, who spoke standard with flawless formality and Verath, with the clipped economy of someone for whom efficiency was a value. He was not unfriendly. He was precise the way that cold rooms were precise. Mercer translated. He noted where idioms required context. He flagged twice, once verbally and once by a prearranged hand signal to Aurel, moments where a Verath term being used by one of the court advisors was carrying a shade of meaning that the standard equivalent being used by the core primary AI system was not capturing fully, not incorrectly, but flatter than the original, drained of a layer that mattered. She acknowledged both flags without interrupting the flow. That was their system, calibrated over 2 days of practice sessions before the summit. She received flags, she made the call, she used them or didn't without breaking stride. It worked. He was otherwise furniture. The Queen spoke infrequently during the first session. This was expected. The briefing had noted that Verath Queens in working sessions typically allowed their senior advisors to manage the technical exchange, reserving their own words for directional moments or for conclusions, or for the specific kind of intervention that reoriented a conversation that had drifted off course. When she did speak, her voice was low and even, and the room changed again in the small way it had when she entered, not louder or more attentive, but differently attentive, in the way that a room attending to music changes when the key changes. Once, midway through the second segment of the session, she said something, and both the core AI and Mercer's own ear produced slightly different standard renderings. The core AI went with its version, which was technically correct. The term she had used had two weight registers, a common, neutral use and an older, more emphatic use, and the AI had chosen the lighter register because it appeared more frequently in similar contexts. The AI was almost certainly right. It was optimizing for common usage. Mercer almost let it go. It was almost certainly right, and he was furniture, and nothing in the exchange so far had suggested that this moment was one of the directional ones. He didn't let it go. He leaned 2 inches forward, the full extent of his ability to signal without physically stepping out of position, and caught Aurel's peripheral attention. She gave him the standby signal with 2 fingers below the line of the table, barely visible. He waited until the court advisor across the table finished his response to the AI's rendering, and then stepped quietly forward and placed a folded card on the table beside Aurel's right hand. Aurel read it without appearing to look at it, a skill Mercer had always privately admired and had never seen her practice and therefore suspected she had simply been born with. The card said, "Heavy Register." She used the emphatic form, older usage, implies structural concern being raised indirectly. Follow-up opportunity. Aurel did not pause. She addressed Vel Shurth with a clarifying question about the transit corridor terms, technically a request for elaboration on a point already made, but framed as an invitation that left the floor open rather than filling it. The kind of question that let someone enter the conversation from the side if they wanted to. The Queen looked at the card. She should not have been able to read it from where she was sitting. The table was long and Mercer had placed the card at Aurel's end. He had not considered that Verath Queens might have exceptional visual acuity, which in retrospect was an oversight. He filed the note away for his next briefing packet annotation, grimly, but there it was. She had looked at the card. She had read it. She looked at it, then at Aurel. Then, and Mercer was almost certain this was not his imagination, though he acknowledged the possibility that he was projecting because of the morning, at him. Then she answered the follow-up question, using the term she had used before but this time adding a single syllable that made the emphatic reading explicit rather than implied, not clarifying what she had said for the benefit of the room, choosing to say it clearly, now that the opening existed. The court advisor beside her, Vel Shurth, efficient and precise, looked at his sovereign for approximately half a second. Something passed between them in that half-second that Mercer couldn't fully decode. Not surprise, not displeasure, but the specific look of someone recalibrating their read of a situation they thought they already understood. The session continued. Vel Shurth answered Aurel's question directly, and the exchange moved into the territory the Queen had indicated, which turned out to be productive. Mercer translated and was furniture and did not think about the moment, except that he thought about it precisely once more briefly at the end of the session when he was tallying his notes. The morning had been unusual in several ways. At the recess, which lasted 40 minutes and was held in an adjacent chamber with a long table of Verath diplomatic refreshments, small, careful arrangements of substances in amber and deep violet that smelled of something warm and unfamiliar, and that the human delegation mostly did not touch because nobody had provided a safety brief, which Mercer noted privately as a gap in the protocol preparation. Aurel found him at the far end of the room and stood beside him for a moment without speaking. She looked out the window at the outer ring of the station. He looked with her. Then she said very quietly, "The bow." "Yes," Mercer said. "Walk me through it." He did. She listened with the complete attention she brought to everything, no expression moving, hands folded in front of her. And when he finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was actually thinking rather than waiting. "You used the Memorial Ascension form," she said. "Yes." "Because you'd been drilling it." "Because I find the harder thing interesting and I overprepared on it." "Yes." She was quiet again, then the Queen's response. She said it was accepted. I know what she said. A pause, and he thought he saw something in her peripheral expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it, like a door with light behind it. "I'm asking what you read from it." Mercer thought about the moment, the 3 heartbeats of silence. The quality of her expression, not offended, not performing graciousness, not managing an awkward subordinate situation the way a senior figure managed things that inconvenienced them. Something more direct than any of that. The way the inclination of her head had been small and precise, like a conclusion reached rather than a courtesy dispensed. "She made a choice," he said. "Not a formal one, a deliberate one. She could have treated it as a linguistic error and moved past it, a small acknowledgement that the liaison had mixed up his forms, no harm done. Or she could have addressed it as a protocol matter formally, which would have been uncomfortable for everyone. She did neither. She received it." Aurel looked at him. "Why?" "I don't know." "Speculate." He was not usually asked to speculate. He was usually asked to be precise, which was a different thing. He turned the question over carefully. "The phrase I used isn't only a form of address," he said. "In the context it carries the reverence, the specific acknowledgement of burden borne and assent made. It's something that's offered to a queen at a moment when her position is newly heavy, not ceremonially, genuinely, like someone saying, 'I see what you're carrying,' rather than 'I acknowledge your title.'" He paused. "She's been queen for 4 years. Whatever it was like at the beginning, it isn't new anymore. The people around her have normalized it. But the phrase doesn't know that. The phrase offers witness of something that most people around her have stopped seeing." Another pause. "Maybe she received what the phrase was actually saying, regardless of the context I said it in. Maybe it landed as real because it was accidental, because I wasn't calculating it." Aurel looked at him for a long moment in which he could not read her face at all. "Write that up for me by end of session today," she said. "Linguistic analysis, cultural annotation, what you observed in the room this morning, what you think it means for the summit dynamics." "Yes, attaché." She moved away to speak to the core primary negotiator, and Mercer stood at the far end of the refreshment table and looked out the tall window at the pale sky of Verath Station's exterior ring. The station was an orbital structure, which meant that its sky was actually the inner surface of the ring's atmosphere bubble, maintained against the vacuum beyond it, held by the station's field systems, giving the interior an odd, bounded horizon that Mercer always found slightly vertiginous if he looked at it too long. He looked at it. He was aware, without turning, that he was not the only person in the recess chamber who was looking out a window at the far end of the room. He did not turn. The second session of the day began an hour later and ran until early evening by station time. It was more technical than the morning, engineering specifications for the new transit relay installations, power requirements, the physical and logistical constraints of the proposed junction points, a sustained and fairly dry exchange about calibration, tolerances that the core AI system handled efficiently, because it was exactly the kind of precise, domain-specific language that AI translation excelled at. Mercer was busier than he had been in the morning. More terms to render, more moments where the AI and his own ear diverged on register if not on content, More flags passed quietly to Aurel. He caught 3 moments where a Verath technical term had a second application in legal contexts that the AI was not surfacing, flagged all 3, and let Aurel decide which to press on. She pressed on 2 of them. He thought she was right about both. He was furniture, efficient and occupied, and at no point in the second session did the Queen look at him. He noticed, which was interesting to notice. He was aware that it was interesting in a way that was not entirely professional, and he filed the observation in the part of his mind marked for annotation later, and translated a passage about relay frequencies, and made a note about a potential double meaning in the Verath technical term for installation timing. She spoke twice in the second session, both times on directional points, both times in the way she had in the morning, reorienting a conversation that had been circling, using the fewest words necessary to point it somewhere useful. Mercer translated both, accurately, and both times Velshurth gave his sovereign the same half-second recalibrating look. The session ended. The formal closing of the day's proceedings was brief acknowledgments, a confirmation of the next day's schedule, the formal exchange of session seals. Aurel delivered the human delegation's closing in Standard, and Mercer rendered it in Verath. He was very careful with the honorifics this time. Precisely, correctly, unambiguously careful. The working session form, correct tonal inflection, the register that was appropriate and unremarkable and gave no one anything to look at. Clean and forgettable, exactly as a good translation should be. The Queen said nothing at the formal close. Her eyes moved across the human delegation once, a sweep that might have been routine, and then she turned with her court and walked back through the far doors, and the chamber became a room again. Mercer gathered his materials. He wrote Aurel's brief in his head on the walk back to the delegation's quarters, organizing it in the order she preferred. Observation first, analysis second, implications third, open questions last. He was thinking about the brief. He was not thinking about the 3 heartbeats of silence that morning, or the specific precision of the word she had used when she said it is accepted, or the way she had chosen that particular phrasing, declarative, present tense, neither formal nor dismissive, rather than the dozen other options available to her. He was not thinking about any of that on the walk back. He was thinking about it on the walk back. The delegation's quarters were 4 rooms in the guest wing of the chamber complex, comfortable and cold in the same way everything in the complex was cold. Mercer spent the first part of the evening writing Aurel's linguistic analysis, 90 minutes, 4 pages, which ran longer than she'd asked for because he couldn't find anything to cut without losing something that felt important. He documented the memorial form, the tonal difference, the structural reason his body had executed the bow, and the cultural weight of the specific words she had used in response. He wrote a section on the afternoon's flag moments and what they implied about the transit corridor discussion. He ate something from the Corps' own supply, a meal that was nutritionally adequate and had no particular relationship with pleasure, and was reviewing his notes for the next day for the 3rd time when the courier arrived. Not a digital transmission. A physical courier, in Verath court livery, the indigo and silver sash of the inner chamber staff, who presented a sealed envelope to the delegation's door attendant with the formal 2-handed presentation gesture, and then withdrew without waiting for a response. The door attendant brought it to Aurel. Aurel read it. She looked at it for a moment longer than she normally looked at things, which told Mercer it was unusual before she turned and crossed the common room to where he was seated at the side table with his notes. She put the envelope in front of him. He read it. It was written in formal Verath, in a clean, precise hand, not the hand of a secretary or court scribe, but something more direct. It bore the court seal in the upper left corner and was written in the Vel-Thurak register, which Mercer recognized from the briefing packet's section 14, the optional reading section. Vel-Thurak, informal exchange between equals, with the specific implication that the ranks of the participants are set aside for the duration of the meeting, the acknowledgement of status present in the background but not operative in the conversation. It was addressed, by full name and role, to Davin Mercer, Cultural and Linguistic Liaison, Human Alliance Third Reach Diplomatic Corps. It invited him to join the Queen for a private evening meeting in the second gallery at the 7th hour, which by station time was in 38 minutes. He read it twice. He was aware that his pulse had done something. "Aurel," he said. "I read it," she said. "She wants to meet with me personally. The liaison, not the attaché, not the senior negotiator, not Mercer. I bowed at her this morning because I drilled the wrong form on the shuttle. Mercer." She said it with the same inflection she used when she was closing a line of discussion rather than continuing it. "Go. There's no protocol for this. The briefing packet doesn't cover." "It doesn't cover it because it doesn't happen," she said, "which is precisely why it matters." She was quiet for a moment. "Go to the meeting. Listen more than you speak. You're good at that. Translate everything you observe internally the way you do and write me a full brief afterward." A pause. "And don't bow." "That is an extremely reasonable instruction," he said. He had 36 minutes. He changed his jacket to the slightly more formal of the two he had packed, reviewed the Vel-Thurac protocol in his margin notes, rank set aside, first name register permitted, offer of first name basis must be accepted before using it, do not use it unless offered, and walked to the second gallery. The second gallery was a different kind of room. He could tell from the temperature before he saw anything warmer than the formal chambers, the air moving slightly, carrying the faint undertone of whatever the station used for its atmospheric system. The lighting was different too, not the flat, even illumination of the working chambers, but something layered, with an amber-tinted cast that he thought was probably the Verath equivalent of evening, the visual signal that the operational part of the day had ended and something else had begun. He had 2 minutes before the 7th hour, and he used them. The room held a series of display cases along one curved wall, each containing objects that caught and held his attention, even as he was supposed to be moving toward the designated meeting point. Navigational instruments in cases of aged metal, their design distinct from anything human-made in a way that made his fingers want to examine them. The casing of one instrument bore Verath numerals that he could partially read, a dating notation, unless the character at the end was an ordinal rather than a year suffix, which would change the reading entirely and require knowing which system the manufacturer had used. He made a note, mentally, for the briefing annotations. Treaty documents under preservation glass, the script archaic, the seal marks layered in multiple colors that indicated, he thought, different signatory parties, each color a different reach, the 7-pointed orbital appearing in all of them in variations that tracked how the seal had evolved over time. He could see 3 distinct iterations of the orbital across the documents in this case alone, one with closed points, one with small circles at the tips, one that matched the pendant at the Queen's throat. What looked like a fragment of a ship's hull, original material, not a reproduction, the edges not cut but fractured, as though it had been taken from a wreck rather than from a decommission, with Verath text etched directly into the metal in the way that meant it had been written in a moment of need without tools, by someone who wanted the words to outlast the moment. The etch marks were irregular, some deeper than others, the hand behind them not a scribe's hand. He could read about half of it. The rest was archaic enough to resist him. He stood in front of that case for a moment longer than he had time for, because it bothered him in the specific productive way that things he couldn't fully read always bothered him, and then he turned and walked to the far end of the gallery. At the far end of the gallery, a wide viewport framed the stars. The Queen was standing at the viewport. She was not in court dress. She wore something simpler, dark-structured cloth that might have been civilian, or might have been a simpler grade of formal that Mercer didn't have a category for yet. No court panels, none of the hammered silver work of the day's proceedings, none of the layered formal weight. Her hair had been released from its structured form and fell in silver-white waves over her shoulders, longer than it had appeared when it was pinned. She still wore the 7-pointed orbital pendant at her throat, the personal one rather than the ceremonial seal. She was looking at the stars. She turned when he entered. He had not made a sound, and he noted that as a piece of information about her attention, and looked at him with the same quality he had noticed in the chamber, the complete and unhurried directness that he was beginning to think might simply be how she looked at things she was actually interested in. Mercer had prepared on the walkover a correct Verath greeting in the Vel-Thurac register. He had it ready, tones right, no bow, register appropriate to the form. She spoke first. "Sit," she said in standard. He sat. She crossed the room without hurrying and took the chair at an angle to his, close enough for real conversation, far enough to be a choice. For a moment she simply looked at him, not evaluating or not only that. More like the way you looked at something you had been curious about, and now had time to examine without the formality of the formal context around it. "Your Verath," she said, "is very good." He almost used the formal address. He caught himself at the second syllable. "Thank you." The corner of her mouth moved. "You almost used the honorific." I caught it. I noticed. She was quiet for a moment this morning. "I'm aware. You used the memorial ascension form." "Yes, I apologize for." "That is not what I said." Her voice was even, not correcting him sharply, just correcting him accurately. "I said you used the memorial ascension form. I did not say I wanted an apology." He was quiet. "That form," she said, "is not commonly known outside Verath scholarship. It is not in the standard diplomatic briefing packets. I know this because my court prepares those packets and I review what goes into them." "It was in a cultural footnote in section 12 of my packet," Mercer said. "I flagged it as interesting." She looked at him. "You read the footnotes." "I read all 47 pages." Something shifted in her expression, not dramatically, not performing anything, the small shift of a door opening a fraction. Most diplomatic liaisons rely on AI systems for primary translation and review only the sections flagged as high priority. "That's reasonable practice," he said. "I prefer to read the material myself." "Why?" He thought about it, because she was asking sincerely and the question deserved a sincere answer. AI translation systems are excellent at rendering meaning accurately. They're less reliable at rendering what isn't being said. The gaps, the places where what someone chooses not to say is as important as what they do say, or where the word someone chooses over its near synonym tells you something about the register they're working in. He paused. "You can't catch those from a summary." She looked at him steadily. "This afternoon, when you passed the card to your attaché about the term I used in the transit corridor discussion." "Yes." The AI system's rendering was not incorrect. "No," he agreed. "It was accurate. The term you used has 2 weight registers, the lighter one is more common, and the AI selected it correctly by frequency. But the heavier register changes the implication of what you were raising, not the content, the weight behind the content. The AI rendered what you said. I thought the heavier register rendered what you meant." "How did you determine which I intended?" "Sentence rhythm," he said. "The pacing of the second half of the phrase. You took the fuller form, you didn't compress it. If you'd meant the lighter register, you would have been slightly shorter. You weren't." She was quiet. He did not feel it. "I may have been wrong," he said. "The follow-up question was designed to let you clarify, not to commit the delegation to a particular interpretation. If I misread—" "You did not misread," she said. Silence. The stars outside the viewport were very still. The transit corridor terms, she said after a moment, are the part of this summit that my court believes is settled. They are not settled. She looked at the viewport, then back at him. There is a concern that has not been formally raised, because raising it formally would require acknowledging a structural problem in the Vale Accord that my court would prefer not to acknowledge publicly. The accord was foundational for 30 years. To revise it is to imply that the original was imperfect. And your predecessor wrote it. She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was the same, even direct, but there was a quality in it that he had not heard in the formal sessions. My mother wrote it, yes. He understood then what the weight was. Not simply the political difficulty of treaty revision. Not simply the court's institutional resistance to admitting that a foundational document had gaps. The weight was the specific, particular difficulty of carrying something someone you loved had built, trying to honor what it was while seeing clearly, every day, what it could no longer do, trying to be a faithful heir to a work that needed to become something else. That's a hard place to be, he said. It was a simple thing to say. He was aware that it was not a diplomatic observation, not an analytical one, not something he had been authorized to offer. He said it anyway, because she had set rank aside for this meeting and he had accepted that framing, and in that framing it was the accurate thing. Yes, she said. It is. They talked for 2 hours. Not only about the summit, though the summit came into it. In the first hour, the transit corridor concern came clear. The specific structural gap in the Vale Accord, what it had been designed for, what had changed since then, and what she believed needed to happen to address it without requiring a public admission that her mother's work had failed. By the end of that hour, Mercer had a clearer picture of what she was actually trying to do than he suspected most of the official delegations had constructed from 8 months of formal communication. She thought precisely, and was not afraid of the complicated shape of a problem, which he appreciated. She also did not simplify for him, which he appreciated more. In the second hour, the conversation moved in the way that conversations sometimes moved when rank was genuinely set aside. Sideways, then wider. She asked about Standard's tense system and why humans distinguished so sharply between past and present when both were equally true. He tried to explain the underlying philosophy and found it harder than he'd expected. Not because he didn't know it, but because explaining a thing you've always taken for granted required first noticing what you'd taken for granted, and that turned out to be disorienting in a useful way. He told her about the word for asterisk witness in 3 of the other languages he spoke, and how each one captured a different angle of the same concept. The form that meant I have seen what you have done, the form that meant I am evidence that you existed asterisk, the form that meant simply I was there. She listened with the same complete attention she gave to everything. He had the impression that she did not stop paying attention to things, that her mind did not drift, and that this was not a trained skill but simply how she was. Why languages, she asked. How did this become your work? I had a grandmother who spoke 4, he said. She taught me that the shape of a language tells you the shape of how the people who built it think, what they found necessary to distinguish. What they grouped together and decided was the same thing. And what does Verath tell you? He thought about it carefully because she was asking for a real answer and she would know if he gave her a polished one. That precision matters to you. Your language has 17 words for the concept of obligation that each carry a distinct weight and directionality. Who owes to whom, what kind of debt it is, whether it was chosen or inherited or imposed. Most languages have 2 or 3. He paused. It also tells me that you think about time differently. Your tense system treats the past as still actively present rather than completed. Was asterisk and is coexist in the same verb form. They do, she said. The past does not stop being true when it stops being now. No, he agreed. It doesn't. A silence that was comfortable in the way silences between people who have been talking for a long time became comfortable. Not empty, not waiting to be filled, but shared. She was looking at the viewport. He was looking at it too, or at the general direction of it, though he was less focused on the stars than on the awareness that the previous 2 hours had been unlike any working conversation he'd had in 3 years of diplomatic liaison work, and that he was not entirely sure what category they belonged in, and that he found he didn't need them to belong in a category right now. "The fragment," he said, "in the display case near the entrance, the whole piece. I couldn't read all of it." She turned to look at him. "About half," he said. "The second section resisted me." The script was archaic enough that the third word in the second line was doing something I couldn't parse. "The Velmora fragment," she said. "It is from the ship that carried the first Accord delegation to the outer reaches. They lost navigation in a sheer event 2 days before the signing. The captain wrote on the hull while they were waiting to see whether anyone would find them." A pause. "The line you couldn't read says, 'We came here to make the thing permanent, and now we are learning what permanent means.'" He was quiet, turning that over. "They were found," she said. "The Accord was signed. The fragment is in that case because my mother put it there when she drafted the revision she never completed. She said it reminded her that permanence was the goal, not the starting point." She looked back at the stars. "I have not moved it." He thought about the Verath tense system. Asterisk was and is asterisk in the same verb form. He thought about a mother who had put a fragment on a shelf to remind herself of something, and a daughter who had left it there. "You haven't moved it," he said. "No. But you're revising the Accord." "Yes." Her voice was even. "Because she didn't get to finish, and because what she started was right even when it was incomplete, and because—" She stopped for a moment and then continued in the same even voice, "because I think she would have wanted it finished more than she would have wanted it preserved exactly as she left it." He did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that was more useful than the silence. After a moment she looked at him, with the gold eyes direct and fully present. "Your standard," she said, "has a word we do not have in Verath." She said it with the careful quality of someone choosing something they'd wanted to say. "A very common one." A pause. "The word asterisk mistake." He waited. "We have a word for error," she said. "We have a word for miscalculation. We have a word for choosing wrongly. But we do not have a word that carries the implication that a thing done incorrectly is therefore without value, that the wrongness erases what the action produced." She looked at him. "Your word asterisk mistake implies that taking the wrong path means arriving nowhere worth keeping." He understood what she was telling him. "This morning," he said, "was not a mistake." "No," she said. "It was not." The viewport held a full field of stars now, the station's slow rotation having carried the gallery past the outer ring and into the open dark beyond. "The transit corridor," he said. "What you're trying to say, the thing about the structural gap that isn't getting said in the formal sessions. Do you want me to give you the standard formulation, the precise one? The one that says what you actually mean without the ambiguity that the current drafting creates?" She looked at him. "I'm a liaison," he said, "specifically linguistic. I can write you the exact standard construction. The one that carries the weight you want it to carry, that says the thing in a way both delegations will understand precisely, without requiring you to characterize the Accord as flawed in so many words." He paused. "We can call it informal technical assistance if that framing is easier." "That," she said slowly, "is not something that diplomatic liaisons typically offer." "No," he agreed, "but you're trying to get something said that isn't getting said, and I understand what the thing is, and I have the vocabulary in both languages." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him with that gold-eyed directness that he had, sometime in the past 2 hours, entirely stopped finding unsettling. "Davin Mercer," she said, using his full name for the first time, not formally, just directly, in the way that names worked in Vel Thurak when someone had decided to actually use them. Cultural and linguistic liaison. Yes. Will you write me the phrase? He did, on a card, the core card stock, physical as before in Standard and in Verath, with a note at the bottom explaining the specific construction choice. Why this framing rather than the alternatives? What load-bearing work the word order was doing? Why the particular honorific structure at the close of the Verath version positioned the concern as a forward-looking observation rather than a retroactive criticism. She read it twice, in the careful way she read things. "This is correct," she said. "Yes." She folded it once precisely and placed it in the inner pocket of the dark jacket. Then she was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars, and he did not fill the quiet. "I will use this in session tomorrow," she said, "not attributed." "Of course not. You will be there." "That's my job." "Yes." Another pause, and he thought he saw, just briefly, for a moment, something that was not the queen and not the diplomat and not the sovereign managing a summit. Just a person in a warm room at the end of a long day, saying something real. "I mean that I find it useful to know someone in the room is listening for what doesn't get said, not just what is said." "I'll be there," he said. She nodded, not formally, just a nod. He stood when she did. He used the Vel Thurac closing, which was short and genuine, and she answered it in Standard, one word, which was good, and he walked back through the gallery with the card stock in his jacket and the stars visible through every viewport he passed. He wrote Aurel's brief at midnight. It ran 6 pages, which was longer than she'd asked for and shorter than what he felt he had, and he found he could not cut it without losing something that seemed important to the record. He covered the transit corridor concern, the structural issue with the Vel Accord, the phrase he'd provided, and the reasoning behind its construction, and his assessment of what tomorrow's third session might look like if she used it and the delegations were paying attention. Then he wrote a final section he labeled * general observation, and which said, "I think she has been doing this alone for 4 years and has become very skilled at it, and is also, underneath the skill, tired of it in the specific way that comes from being surrounded by people who are loyal to your position rather than to the actual content of your thinking. She receives what she is given carefully in the right register and uses it with precision. When given something that was not calculated this morning, she also received that, more carefully than the calculated things. She chose to. This is my impression and not a professional assessment, and I am including it because I think it is accurate and because I think it matters for the summit dynamics, which is how I am justifying putting it in this brief." He looked at that paragraph for a while. He left it in. The third session was the contested one. 5 hours, with a break at the midpoint, covering the matters that the first 2 sessions had been building toward. The specific terms of the transit corridor framework, the junction points, the licensing structure. It was not comfortable. Vel Shurth was precise and thorough, and not inclined to move quickly on anything. Aurel was patient and deliberate and equally thorough, and between the two of them the session had the quality of 2 very careful people disassembling a complicated mechanism together, checking each component before setting it aside. Mercer translated, he flagged, he passed cards, he was furniture. At the beginning of the afternoon segment, after the break, the Queen spoke. She used the phrase he had written. She said it in Standard first, then gave the Verath parallel herself, in the heavier register, with the word order that made the load-bearing distinction explicit. Clear and precise and unambiguous. The thing that had been not quite said for 8 months of formal communication said. The room changed. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no reversal and no confrontation. What happened was quieter than that and more consequential. The thing that everyone in the room had been circling around, approaching from different angles and never quite landing on, was suddenly there in the center of the table in language that both delegations could read without ambiguity. Vel Shurth looked at his sovereign for 1 second, the recalibrating look again, longer this time. Something in his expression shifted, not quite surprise, more like the look of a man who had been expecting to have a certain conversation, and was now recognizing that the conversation was going to be different than he'd planned, and deciding whether that was better or worse. Aurel did not look at Mercer. The senior Verath negotiator, after a pause that was shorter than the moment warranted, engaged with the point directly. He asked 3 precise questions. Aurel answered 2 of them and deferred the third to the core technical specialist, who had been waiting for something concrete to engage with since the session opened. The exchange moved. The session found its footing. Mercer was very busy for the next 2 hours. More flags, more cards, more moments where the gap between what was being said and what was meant required careful navigation. He earned his function in that session in a way that felt like the difference between being useful and being present, and by the end of it, he was tired in the good way, the way that came from doing the actual work. He was aware that once, in the middle of the afternoon segment, when the room had paused on a translation question and briefly made him the center of attention, the Queen looked at him. Not formally, not acknowledging him in a way that was visible to the room, just looking, the way she looked at the things she was actually attending to. He held the look for 2 seconds, which was exactly as long as the translation question lasted, and then returned his attention to the session. The summit concluded on the 4th day, on schedule, with a joint statement and the formal signing of the updated transit corridor framework. The signing was brief and ceremonial, and then the delegations filed out of the chamber, in the reverse of the order they had entered, human delegation first, which was the visitors' precedence, and the summit was done. On the evening of the 3rd day, after the most difficult session, Aurel and the core primary negotiator and the technical specialist had dinner together in the delegation quarters and discussed what had happened in the afternoon. The transit corridor framework, Aurel said, had become possible because of a remarkably clear articulation of the structural concern, something that had made it possible to address the issue directly rather than continuing to approach it sideways. She said this without looking at anyone. The primary negotiator asked where it had come from. Aurel said she had received useful linguistic support from the delegation's liaison. The primary negotiator nodded and moved on to the next thing, and Mercer ate his meal and did not add to it. On the morning of departure, he was packing his materials when the second courier arrived. Court livery again, physical envelope again. This one smaller, the seal simpler, not the full court seal, the smaller personal form. Inside was a card, 2 lines in Verath, no formal heading, no attribution. He translated them in his head immediately, the way he did everything. The phrase is kept. The one who heard the weight of it is also kept, in the record that is still present. Below the Verath lines in standard, added deliberately, he suspected, for the liaison who read footnotes and understood why the distinction mattered, a single word. Witness. He looked at the card for a long time. Then he placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket, where it stayed for the rest of the morning, and the formal departure procedure, and the transit to the docking level, and the wait for the shuttle. It was still there on the shuttle when the station fell away behind them and the transit route opened ahead. He did not take it out again. He knew what it said. He thought about the Verath tense system, was and is asterisk in the same verb form, the past still actively present, still true, and thought that she had understood something about language that most people spent their whole lives not quite arriving at. That words were not merely descriptive. That the right ones, given in the right moment, changed the shape of what had happened and what would happen, made certain things real that had been uncertain. He thought about the Vel Thurak meeting, the warm room, the stars, the way she had looked at the card he had written before folding it into her pocket. The look before the fold, that specific, unhurried quality of attention she gave to things she was actually reading, not performing the reading of. He had watched her read his card the way he watched people translate in their heads, The small pause at the construction he had chosen for the Verath version, which was slightly unexpected, the brief stillness when the meaning settled into place, and then the completion of the motion, the fold, the pocket. She had placed it in the inner pocket, not the working pocket that held session materials. He had noticed that. He was not sure what to do with having noticed it, except that he had, and it was part of the record now, which meant it would still be true later. He thought about 17 words for obligation. He looked out the shuttle's viewport at the transit dark, and he thought, I will find a reason to be on the next accreditation list for Verath diplomatic contact, if one comes up. He thought that is not entirely professional. He thought it is, nonetheless, completely true. He thought about the way her voice had sounded, when she said the past does not stop being true when it stops being now asterisk, with the steady directness of someone who had learned it the hard way and was no longer interested in pretending otherwise. The stars moved past the viewport. The shuttle carried him homeward. The card in his pocket was a small, specific weight. He was a linguistic liaison. His work was the gap between what was said and what was meant, the space where languages touched each other and left marks on both sides of the contact. He was good at it. He had been good at it today. He thought he had done good work. He thought also that there were kinds of work he had not quite known he was missing, until this mission, until a morning in a cold, formal chamber when his body had bowed before his judgment could stop it, and a queen had received the bow as something worth receiving. He thought about the word witness in every language he knew. In Standard I was there, I saw. What I saw is now part of the record. In Verath I am here. What you carry is known to me. The knowing does not end when the moment does. Outside the viewport, the stars were fixed and very far and still exactly where they had always been. He was carrying something home. He thought that was probably worth keeping.